Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Could hallucinogenic drugs like LSD and MDMA be the key to treating diseases like schizophrenia and depression, or are they too dangerous? So I have found out so much about our online community from today's subject, digital producer Malika Bilal, and their relationship to drugs.
As have I. Let's just say looking through some of these tweets was quite the trip.
Right.
I would say that our community is mostly on the side of drug research. They're very pro it. There are some very vocal critics, however, but for just a taste of what most of our community members are saying, I want you to listen to this video comment from our dedicated stream community member, Michael.
Cultural baggage and miseducation aside, there's no legitimate reason to limit research on psychedelics. We already know from preliminary research that MDMA might and seems to be useful for the treatment of PTSD and combat stress. Ketamine has been shown to be useful for treating depression and drug addiction. And there's a whole host of other psychedelics that need to be researched. From doing so, we'll find out so much more about the mind, the body, the brain, and how we create reality.
We'd like to hear your reality as well, so tweet us your questions and your comments with hashtag AJStream.
And before we get to that conversation, check out our website at stream.aljazeera.com/story, and there you'll find today's story. You can scroll through all of our added information, our web extras and exclusives, and then right at the very bottom of the page, you can comment on the program.
Hi, I'm Gareth Bonwell, and I'm in the stream.
Have we lost decades of research on the benefits of psychedelic drugs because of legal restrictions? Some scientists claim that LSD and MDMA, that's a compound sometimes found in ecstasy, hold the key to treating illnesses like PTSD and depression. They want an end to the rules limiting their research. Others, though, say they are too dangerous to experiment with, and they may cause more long-term harm than good. Both the US and the United Nations say these drugs serve no medicinal purpose. Is it time for the world to actually reconsider this, though? Today, we'll speak to experts about the research they have done on psychedelics and if legal controls on them should be eased. So, joining our conversation, we have Bertha Madras. She is a professor of psychobiology at Harvard Medical School. She's worked in the White House on national drug control policy. From London, David Nart is the chair of the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs and a professor at Imperial College. From Boston, Rick Doblin is founder of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS. And from Los Angeles, Rachel Hope was a long-time sufferer of PTSD, and she has used MDMA-assisted psychotherapy as treatment for her illness. So it's great to have you all here in the stream. I'm going to start with a case, a real-life case. Rick, you know Rachel. How do you know Rachel?
Well, Rachel was a subject in one of our studies, and after she was completed with her treatment, she felt that she was willing to speak to the media about it so that other people could receive the help that she received.
All right.
In the context of that, we met.
Okay, all right. So, Rachel, what was it that happened to you that made you go to MAPS, which is where Rick works? Take us through that journey.
Well, I had a very traumatic childhood, all forms of child abuse. It was, and I survived that. And I also had a truck hit me when I was 11 years old, which was, made it even worse. And I started developing symptoms not unlike a combat veteran. Startle reflex, panic attacks, night terrors, hypervigilance. It was like my fight or flight reflex was stuck on, and that continued. Even though I tried every kind of therapy, I tried psychotherapy, rapid eye movement therapy, different kinds of drugs. I mean, I really did everything for like 20 years.
Rachel, did anything help?
Well, to a certain degree, I started to understand why I was so sick, and that helped to a degree, but my symptoms just kept getting worse. They just were completely resistant to treatment.
Right.
And, one doctor after the next would just say, we don't really have a way to treat you. And I was hopeless.
So PTSD, a lot of people don't even understand it. We're getting a better understanding of it, but how did that affect your life for 20 years? Give us an example of what would happen to you or how you'd have to go through life with PTSD.
Oh, it's insane. I don't actually know how I made it. I had, chronic sleep deprivation from nightmares. I had ulcers. I had, my relationships were strained because I was paranoid. I was irritated. I was defensive. I was always on guard. It was like my system was still ready to fight and to try and survive. Even though I was relatively safe and my life got better, my body, my mind didn't believe it.
All right, so we've gone through 20 years of this, and then what?
Yes. I found out about the clinical trial for using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to treat PTSD. I thought it was a long shot. I'm not a drug user. I was it was difficult for me to even use antidepressant medications or any kind of medications prescribed to me. And I was, like many other people, skeptical. But I was desperate. I needed help, and I went and I got accepted to the clinical trial, and I was totally amazed.
And how are you now? How's life for you now?
I am cured of PTSD.
Wow. All right, so we need to know the science, David. What's the science? How did that happen? How did that work for Rachel?
Well, we don't yet know, but our imaging studies of MDMA suggest that it dampens down the parts of the brain which are overactive in PTSD. And so it allows people to come to terms with the emotions and get what we call cognitive control over them. And therefore live a life without this hyperactivity, this sense of being in fight or flight that Rachel so vividly describes.
Well, Bertha, we heard Rachel's story and how being in that MDMA trial helped her. We're also hearing from people online with their own experiences. Politically Questioned tweets in, cannabis is essential for my and others' PTSD and safety. Risks of this and other needed drugs are introduced by criminalization, this person says. Another person writes in that psilocybin, others may refer to this as mushrooms, caused me to quit a 15-year pack-a-day cigarette addiction. So, Bertha, are you convinced by these kinds of stories, and is that enough to support more research into these?
Well, I'm certainly not convinced by a single story. I am sure that for Rachel, this may have been an effective drug, but that's certainly not how drugs and medications are approved by the United States and by most responsible countries in the world. They are not approved by anecdotes, they are not approved by personal stories, because Rachel's story is a compelling one. I'm sure she has suffered enormously throughout her life and now feels a lot better. Whether or not the MDMA was the sole factor, it is difficult to know. The only way to really approve a drug and to have it accepted for medical use is to go through the rigorous FDA process. And one cannot do this by one individual story. For every Rachel, there are others who have tried MDMA, who have tried methylene dioxide, methamphetamine, and have had adverse consequences. And there are individual stories that we could bring forward. The only way to approve a drug is through the FDA process, and the FDA process requires that you not only prove that a drug is effective,
right,
but that it is safe, and it's safe on a population basis, not safe for 19 people or 20 people, and that is the issue here.
Bertha, I would say I completely agree with what you've just said, and that we are engaged in trying to go through the FDA. Because the pharmaceutical companies aren't interested, we're going at it in a nonprofit context. And I think I would disagree, though, with this idea that for every Rachel, there's somebody that had an adverse event, because Rachel was in a clinical study with 20 people, as you indicated, and over 80% of those people were cured of PTSD, and we have not found negative side effects from their participation in that study. And we've just been anticipating that we're going to need around 400 people or so in our phase 3 studies, and that it's going to take us till 2021 to develop it into an FDA-approved prescription medicine, but under experimental conditions with pure MDMA. And it's not the MDMA only, it's the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy that's the combination treatment. that with that kind of support, we think that a vast majority of the people will be able to make substantial progress reducing their PTSD symptoms.
See, Rachel, I see you nodding and smiling there. Do you hear this sort of scientific debate that's going backwards and forwards? What do you make of it? Because really, the people who could either value or benefit the most are people like yourself. So when you hear scientists go backwards and forwards, what's your reaction?
Well, I can only judge from my experience and apparently the other people in the clinical trial that we had extraordinary results that and no side effects. So I believe that what makes me frustrated is I got well and there's so many people I meet who are really sick and I don't know what to do, where to send them, what clinic to send them to, because the truth is it's not MDMA and it's not psychotherapy, it's the combination of the two in a clinical setting that's safe that produced my results. And I know that. So I know this is a debate, but from my standpoint, I can't imagine how people are feeling stuck in the prison that I was stuck in, not knowing what to do or what hope they have. And then I have the answer. I have to be telling everybody, and I don't know where to send them to get this treatment. Well, that's all I know.
David, Rachel just said she doesn't know where to send people. Online, we're hearing somewhat of the same thing. Have a listen to this video comment from Stephen Locke.
I'm a practicing psychiatrist, and I know that there are not very many new drugs in the pipeline for the treatment of depression. I wonder whether drugs that are being abused have the potential to be used for the treatment of depression, and I'd like to be involved in clinical research. What are the steps I'd have to take? What are the obstacles and barriers?
So David, that's a very practical example there. What are the barriers towards being able to incorporate that into his research and practice?
Well, they are substantial. So we are setting up the first trial of psilocybin mushrooms in resistant depression. And it's taken almost 2 years to get through the regulatory process in Britain, which is probably the same as in the USA. And the barriers are not about the clinical trials. They're about this bizarre idea that drugs like mushrooms and MDMA are somehow more dangerous and therefore need much greater levels of control than drugs like morphine and heroin. So there's a disproportionate level of control for researchers with these drugs, and that's the thing I would like to change, because until we change it, there will never be the research that is necessary.
So David, where do you even get, so for this MDMA research, where do you actually even get the drugs from?
Well, it's extremely difficult because they're illegal drugs, and in order for a company to manufacture the drugs, in Europe they need licenses, which means they've got to put money up front to buy the licenses. It takes about a year to get a license. It increases the cost of the drug about tenfold in order comparison with any other kind of drug. So immediately you're faced with this enormous financial barrier, and Rick and co have really struggled, but they've done well to begin to get over that in the USA, but it's still been very hard for them, and most individuals just haven't got the time and the resources to engage in this research. It just takes people like me and Rick who kind of dedicated our lives to it. Most people just wouldn't bother.
See, there's a conundrum here, isn't there? Because Bertha, you said you need proper research and data, and then David is saying it's really expensive. We can't even get hold of the drugs and the licenses to actually do the research. So it says there's a catch-22 going on just right there.
Well, I don't think that's a real catch-22. I have gone through the FDA process with a cocaine analog. And of course, we had all sorts of constraints on us, none of which were, in fact, daunting. They were quite straightforward. A 2-year wait is trivial by comparison with some drugs because it does require an enormous amount of documentation to do any clinical trial. You have to have preclinical data, and if the preclinical data shows a level of toxicity, you have to reassure the approval process that this drug in fact will not be toxic in humans, as we have with, for example, MDMA. So I don't think that, I do think that it's a bit of a canard or a red herring to say that the regulatory process is daunting. I know what it is, I've been through it, And not only is it fair, but it is designed above all to protect the health and well-being of individuals and of the population as a whole.
Okay.
Well, Bertha, I would add, though, that with the FDA, starting in 1990, they put science over politics. And so we have been able to work through the FDA to get permission, but at certain points where we had to get the DEA licenses, it took 5-6 months. And we had to go to the U.S. Senate to get senators to pressure the DEA to finally let the studies happen. In Canada, we had 5 years to get permission. 3 years of it was about what kind of safe would store 8 grams of MDMA. And it took 3 years for Health Canada to come out with the regulation. So we've got the study in Canada started. We've overcome the regulatory issues in most countries of the world. We still have problems with GMP MDMA, but that's just going to be a matter of $200,000 or so for a kilogram. But I think that we have wasted decades and decades from 1970 to 1990 in the United States, where this research was blocked in the US and all over the world. And now, after incredible struggles, we are at a point where we can gather the data and satisfy the kind of skeptical concerns that you rightly have. And so what we're lacking is funding, which is coming only from donors, not from government support, but we're working to overcome that as well. But I think that from medical marijuana point of view, we're still unable to buy the marijuana. The U.S. government has a monopoly on the supply of marijuana. We have an FDA-approved study for marijuana for post-traumatic stress disorder in 50 U.S. veterans. 3 years we've been trying just to buy the marijuana, and so far have been unsuccessful.
Rick, let me just bring in the community here.
Frankly,
Rick and Bertha, hold tight for a minute, because I want to bring in our community to the conversation. Just hold those thoughts so we can get the community in before we run out of time. Go ahead.
Well, Rick, what you were just saying, we just got a tweet in just a couple minutes ago. Taylor agrees with you. She says, what about those who suffer and decline while waiting for the quote unquote rigorous FDA process? That process can take years. But Rachel, I want to go to you and shifting gears here a little bit, because a lot of our community members have brought up the problem that they see with big pharmaceutical companies. Rob on Facebook says, if patients actually got cured using these trials, then big pharma would lose billions, and the government doesn't want that. Another person writes in saying that psychedelics also only need to be taken a few times for them to be effective. Because those medicines don't need to be taken every day, the pharmaceutical industry will spin the dangers of them in a dishonest fashion. So Rachel, what are your thoughts on that?
I thought the same thing. I'm very confused as to why the pharmaceutical company isn't championing something that is so life-giving and has so much potential. But that makes a very good explanation, is that they're going to lose a lot of money. But one thing that confuses me is anybody looking at the classification of these drugs in the first place? Were they wrongly classified? Is that a barrier that has to be re-examined? I mean, was the science that classified them as dangerous and not having any medical purpose in the first place? Can that be overturned?
Let me explain. Yeah, absolutely. Let me explain. These drugs were misclassified originally under the UN conventions as not having medicinal value, even though we knew they had medicinal value. This was a deliberate falsification of the data to appease some very right-wing anti-drug campaigners. And we've suffered the last 50 years as a result of that.
David, that is a huge statement there, Bertha.
I completely and totally disagree with that last statement. These drugs were classified as having no medicinal purposes because for the past 50 years they have not been proven to have medicinal purposes unless you have controlled clinical trials, which are just being generated now. So I don't think
Bertha,
that we can talk conspiracy.
You were wrong there.
Let me finish. Please let me
1961 UN
finish.
convention banned cannabis, and the 64 banning of LSD was based on the supposition they had no medicinal value, even though they have medicinal value. The drugs such as heroin and morphine, which were not banned or put into Schedule 1, had no greater evidence of efficacy than the drugs which were put into Schedule 1. That was a political decision,
I'm afraid
medical
that
or a scientific one.
The science does not support those statements at all. The issue of conspiracies of the right wing and or the pharmaceutical companies is a canard that has been brought up over and over again by people who advocate for full legalization and medicalization of psychoactive drugs. Psychoactive drugs are classified in categories based on the risks to the population. LSD at the time of 1960, I was one of the first people who had access to Sandoz pure LSD to investigate its properties in preclinical studies. I'm very aware of the literature because I knew it from its inception. And the same is true for cannabis. Cannabis as a smoked plant is not modern medicine.
Okay.
The cannabinoids within the plant do have some potential,
Bertha,
but
I
certainly
would
not
comment,
cannabis.
All right.
I would comment that first off, cannabis does not cause lung cancer. The FDA has approved studies with smoked cannabis. There's also vaporization of the whole plant. I think that they can pass risk-benefit calculations, and you may be interested to know that in the next month, the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease is going to publish the first study, a MAP-sponsored study of LSD-assisted psychotherapy in 12 subjects who faced anxiety due to life-threatening diseases.
Rick?
And we've got positive
Yes.
results from that study.
So Rick and
Yes,
David
Rick,
and
can
Rachel,
you answer a simple
Bertha,
question?
just give me a moment.
Yes.
Just give me a moment.
Yes.
Obviously, Rachel, Rick, and David have not convinced you in the least. We will find out if there's more conversation between you and our other three guests in our post show at stream.aljazeera.com. This conversation, this debate will continue. Take a pause just for a moment though, because Malika has some other stories that we're following on the stream.
Our first leads out of Mexico, where if you were planning on naming your child after Rambo or Lady Di, you can't anymore. The state of Sonora has banned 61 names they claim are odd or offensive, arguing they lead to bullying. Michaela tweets, Mexico to ban names like Facebook and panties. Why were these names even allowed in the first place? Well, next, thousands are remembering the plight of child soldiers by participating in International Red Hand Day. Democracy Challenge tweets, today, child soldiers are reported in 21 ongoing conflicts around the world. According to the initiative, there are still more than 200,000 child soldiers worldwide. Finally, a 20-year-old Pakistani exchange student who has been in a coma since November is facing threats of deportation in the U.S. Shahzeb Bajwa will be unable to stay in the country legally once his student visa expires this month. Bajwa's family is concerned the move from Minnesota will be detrimental to his survival. His brother started a campaign to raise funds to put Shahzeb in a nursing home and extend his visa. While others have joined the campaign in solidarity, Salma tweets, we request that he be treated in the same hospital. It's better for him. Well, those are the stories that have caught our eye. Let us know what you're following using hashtag AJStream. Femi?
Thanks, Malika. I have a confession to make. When we started investigating this story, we were talking about MDMA, which is a chemical that's also found in ecstasy. Have a look at my computer. This is the image that I was thinking of when we were talking about this. I was like, how on earth can this be used as drug therapy?
An image that comes to many people's minds.
And these people actually look like they may need some more therapy. So that's the image that I had. But this is actually what it looks like. So if you're trying to think of that when Rachel was going through her therapy, this is from MAPS, and this is how MDMA-assisted psychotherapy works in a sort of treatment setting. So there's a big difference between the image that I had and actually how it actually looks.
And it'll be about changing that public perception because you're not the only one.
Right, absolutely. Okay. We have a conversation to be continued at stream.aljazeera.com. In the meantime, let me tell you about the next program. Does porn kill love? We explore how internet porn can change your brain and your behavior. Maybe today's guest might be tweeting in on that subject. Until then, we'll see you online. Thanks for watching. Hello again, we're discussing the role of psychedelic drugs in the treatment of mental health disease. Let's get right back to that conversation. I hate to interrupt a great debate and conversation. So, Rick and Bertha, I apologise for that. I stepped in because otherwise we'd be banging to the news on Al Jazeera, but we're coming back here for some more time. So, Rick, you're putting your case, Bertha, you're putting your case. It feels like you're both in so far away from each other. Bertha, can you not be convinced by anything that Rick is saying right now?
I would like to ask Rick a simple question. How many patients in studies are used in order to get FDA approval for the vast majority of drugs that are currently approved?
I would say that it's probably 1,000 or so, sometimes more. I think in this particular case, we've already had 850 people, more than that, in phase 1 clinical studies conducted all over the United States. And I've just met with several people who have worked at the FDA, and what they're indicating is that our phase 3 studies would probably be sufficient to have 200 people in each of the phase 3 studies. We've got so far around 50 people treated. We're going to have another 40 or so treated in our phase 2 studies. And I think that will be more than sufficient for working with people like Rachel, who were treatment-resistant, chronic PTSD, who had failed on other medications. And so I think we've got a reasonable drug development plan. And right now, there is over 4,700 papers in Medline on MDMA. We know an enormous amount, over $300 million has been spent on those studies. MDMA is one of the most well-studied drugs ever from the point of view of the FDA.
Yes, I understand that, but your numbers are very bizarre because a phase 1 study is not for efficacy or effectiveness. It's simply for dose response curve in normal people.
Whoa,
and so
Bertha,
800
Bertha,
people
so
sounds
for all of us who
bizarre.
are not doing that, do you want to just explain what that actually means? Because I don't want you to go off and have a conversation that the rest of us are not tuned into.
In order to get a drug through the Food and Drug Administration, you have 3 phases and then a post-marketing phase.
Okay.
In phase 1, you start with a few patients, a few dozen, 20, 30, 40, in which you do not have anybody with a disease state. You have normal people who have not ever necessarily been exposed to the drug, and you give them the drug to see what happens in terms of doses.
All right.
In phase 2, you take another population. This time, it's a control versus a disease population, and you compare them in a blinded study in which you have generally several hundred, up to 400 or 500. And in phase 3, it's usually it could be up to 5,000 people in multi-center trials.
Okay.
So that the numbers don't compute with regard to the FDA criteria. The second thing is that there are numerous studies. There are 4,000 papers on MDMA, but the vast majority of them describe the negative consequences of the drug.
Like what, Bertha?
Cognitive impairment, memory impairment, sleep disorders. There's a vast array of literature on the fact that MDMA does have negative consequences.
Have been done on people using ecstasy in clubs. They haven't been, and using multiple doses over multiple years. There is no evidence from our studies or Rick's studies that the use of 1 or 2 doses in therapy is going to do any harm whatsoever.
Well, David, speaking of some of the negative consequences that Bertha was mentioning, have a listen to this tweet from Abel on Twitter. He says, "I'm diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Why would anyone in their right mind who already deals with psychosis take LSD?" Another person says, "Having worked in acute psych hospitals for over 20 years, I've seen these drugs induce psychotic episodes, some lasting months." So, David, is there a basis to that?
No one is saying that. So this is psychedelics. No one is, and I was certainly not saying psychedelics are safe. And if you have a psychotic illness or a tendency to psychosis, they can be quite dangerous. So what we're saying is that in people who don't have that vulnerability, they could at least be explored as treatments for conditions such as addictions, where they showed quite a lot of efficacy in the 1950s and 60s, in obsessive compulsive disorder, and possibly in some forms of cluster headaches. And that's where the research on psilocybin and possibly LSD should go.
Yeah, and Bertha, I'd like to say that the numbers that we're working with are determined by our negotiations directly with FDA. So we're doing exactly what you suggest, which is to try to work with FDA. Of these 850 plus people that were in phase 1 studies, we have done dose response safety studies and found that it was safe to proceed. But there's also studies looking at what parts of the brain are operational, looking at what effect people have in terms of emotional recognition, in terms of facial recognition. So there's a lot of exploratory studies in healthy normals that are not in patients that have demonstrated the safety of pure MDMA used in clinical settings and have given us some understandings of mechanisms. And in the phase 2 studies, we're not going to be required, as far as I can tell from FDA, to do 400 or 500 people, but whatever they require us to do, that is our intention to do it. So I think you and I are aligned on the view that this sort of research should be subject to FDA regulation and it should be rigorously evaluated. And I think when we do that, we can realize that the risks of these drugs, impure drugs taken in recreational settings, are much different and much greater than the risks of pure drugs taken in therapeutic settings with support. And so I think in those situations, we have found, and the FDA has found, and regulatory agencies all over the world have found that the benefits outweigh the risks.
So where are we right now in terms of research? Because I'm hearing the debate going backwards and forwards. And Bertha, thank you for that clear sort of breakdown of phase 1, 2, 3. Where are we? What phase are you in, David?
We are starting a phase 2 study in resistant depression with psilocybin.
Okay. So how many years are we looking at before not just a few groups of people can maybe, like Rachel here, can maybe benefit from this kind of drug therapy? Are we talking 20 years? Are we talking 50 years? Where are we?
No, well, it won't be 20. I mean, Rick has progressed MDMA very effectively, and I think, I hope, once he's cracked that one, he can help me crack the psilocybin one.
Yeah, we're currently projecting 2021 for the approval of MDMA as a prescription medicine. We're in the midst of phase 2 studies. We've already published 2 successful studies, one in Switzerland and one in the United States. We're currently working with U.S. veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder from Iraq and Afghanistan. We have a study in Boulder. We're studying in Israel with the former chief psychiatrist of the Israeli Defense Forces as the principal investigator. We've got a study in Vancouver, Canada that's starting, and we anticipate in around 2 years, we bring all this data to the FDA for what's called an end of phase 2 meeting. And then you plan, what Bertha is saying is necessary is these phase 3 studies. And there's the possibility, Rachel raised this question about where do people go now. Once we start the phase 3 studies, the FDA has a policy called expanded access, where you can provide it to patients on a compassionate basis, and we're going to be requesting that as well.
Yes, but Rick, what is concerning me is the fact that you already have drawn a pre-conclusion that in 2021 the FDA will approve it without having the results of the phase 2 or phase 3. And that to me says that there is a predetermination in your own mind that it's going to be approved and so many drugs fail in phase 3 that it is concerning to me that you have this mindset that it's going to work without having the science in front of you.
All right. So Rick, can I just ask you to just take a breath for a moment? Because really this conversation is about Rachel and people like Rachel. So Rachel, jump in.
I want to say something. I'm really happy to hear about this vision that should it be approved, then it would have some therapeutic use in clinic with licensed therapists sooner than later. Because what do I do for my veteran friends who want to kill themselves? What do I do with family members who have had chronic depression and who are always suicidal? Where do I send them when I know that, at least for me, and many other people, it had tremendous benefit. Now, here's the weird thing. I'm not saying that I don't think that people should use this recreational. I have too much respect for this medicine. I have too much respect for the research and the sacrifices that MAPS is doing to fund this research. I don't tamper with this at all, and I tell people not to use it recreationally. because we really want to funnel our efforts and put the pressure on to study the medicine and get it approved for the medicine, the people who really need it. But that said, because of my having been treated and gotten well with MDMA, lots and lots and lots of people come up to me and say, oh, I had experience with MDMA. It changed my life. It was so incredible. It was beneficial. It saved my marriage. So I mean, how much are you taking in the data of just massive amounts of people who have somehow got their hands on it? If you want people not to use this recreationally and do dangerous things to themselves, you better reassure them that you're studying this and making sure that it's looked at seriously as a medicine, because other people are finding that it's a medicine.
And Rachel, it's because of stories like yours and the ones that you just mentioned about others that you know that we got this Facebook comment from Mike, who says, it's incumbent upon us as a civilized society to take any step possible to help those with mental diseases. And one of those steps is researching the possible effects of psychedelics. How will we know if we don't try?
Yay, Mike. Yay, Mike. Yay, Mike. Thank you for saying it better than I could say it.
Yeah, and Bertha, I'd like to respond to your comment about bias. And I think that's a really important point. And what I do believe that it'll work, and I'm open in sharing that, but I think the key to bias is scientific methodology. We all have our biases. People funded by NIDA who are trying to find what the risks are of these drugs. So that what I would like to engage with you, and what we are engaging with FDA, is a discussion on what sort of scientific methodology should we be using in our studies to minimize the effect of bias. And I think that's really where the scientific method has been developed, and that's what our focus should be. Not the fact that I believe that it'll work, but what is the methodology that we use to get over our biases to try to get as close as we can to the truth.
Do you know, guests, you're also well informed and also such great conversationalists that if I was listening and watching this program, every time somebody spoke, I'd be completely convinced by what they were saying. So I want to actually maybe give our audience a moment of clarity, perhaps, in a closing thought, very briefly, all of you, because we're now out of time here. But very briefly, Bertha, what does the public, the international public, need to know? What's their takeaway from this conversation?
The most important thing they should take away is three items. Number one, that if we circumvent the FDA process, we are going to be doomed with regard to safe and effective medications in the future. We have to adhere to a rigorous set of standards. I'm going to rush you because literally I have minutes left for everybody. So I'm just going to say, make those points 1, 2, 3, go. So that's the first point. Second point? The second point is equip yourself with scientific knowledge.
Okay, point
because
3.
many people, and point 3 is, above all, anecdotes do not make science. Okay. Individual cases do not make science.
Apologies for rushing you. They will turn the internet off in 2 minutes' time, so we can't play around with that. Rick, your takeaway from this conversation for our audience briefly is what?
This research has been blocked for decades. Because of the FDA and other regulatory agencies, we're finally able to do the science. We have to raise the money from donors through nonprofits. It's not being evaluated by the pharmaceutical industry. And the preliminary evidence of risk and benefit is promising. And I believe that we will be able to bring these drugs through the FDA process and the EMA to make them into prescription medicines.
David.
Yes, I think this blocking of research of the last 50 years is the worst censorship of science and medicine since the Catholic Church banned the telescope in 1616, and we've got to change it.
Succinctly done. Rachel, I'm going to literally give the last word to you. What is it?
There's hope, people, but it takes people to demand that this be researched fairly among all the other things that are researched. And then if you have something to contribute financially to the funding of this research, this is a very, very good place to put the money.
She's Rachel Hope. She's a PTSD sufferer. She used MDMA therapy. Thank you for being part of our conversation. Thank you to Bertha Madras, David Knapp, Rick Doblin, and also that's everybody. And also for you for watching. I appreciate that. On our next show, does porn kill love? We explore how internet porn can change your brain and your behavior. See, that's a conversation I'd love to get David and Rick back in on. Maybe they'll tweet us watching tomorrow. Until then, we'll see you online. Thanks for watching.